In this video, I provide an introduction to the two key readings for topic 4, which asks the question, do people consent to inequality? And the readings are Pierre Bourdieu in conversation with Terry Eagleton and James C. Scott, looking at the question of false consciousness, or laying it on thick, as he puts it. So why are these the key readings on this topic? So Bourdieu is a major theorist of questions around subjective inequality, and he provides one version of the argument about how people consent to their own domination and why that might be the case. Scott provides a set of counter-arguments to that, where he really sort of says we need to reframe the question. It's not, how is it that people are made to consent, but rather, do they consent? And he offers a very different alternative explanation of what's going on, as well as a different framing of the question. So Bourdieu sets out his influential account of symbolic domination, which has been taken up by many people working in this area. And that differs from theories of false consciousness, which you may be familiar with already, because Bourdieu argues that symbolic domination occurs below our conscious awareness. It's not about our consciousness at all. Scott provides an overview of different theories explaining why people apparently consent to inequality or their own domination. He makes some major criticisms of these arguments. He doesn't refer directly to Bourdieu or Bourdieu's theories, but it could be argued that he's actually making criticisms of the sorts of argument that Bourdieu offers. And Scott also offers an alternative explanation of why people, what he says, appear to consent to inequality, although he doesn't actually think they do. So let's look at the first key reading, which is a dialogue between Terry Eagleton and Pierre Bourdieu. It was a public debate, and it's been tidied up and transcribed. Both Bourdieu and Eagleton identify problems with conventional theories of ideology because they rely on a distinction between true and false consciousness, which begs the question of how some people can overcome false consciousness. Eagleton argues that the idea of false consciousness is too simple because people are actually more cynically or shrewdly aware than that would suggest. Bourdieu makes a rather different criticism, and one of the things to be aware in this reading is that Bourdieu and Eagleton don't entirely agree, and Eagleton in particular makes some criticisms of Bourdieu's arguments. For Bourdieu, he has a rather different criticism of the notion of false consciousness. He says that the social world doesn't work in terms of consciousness, what we think. It works in terms of practices, what we do. And often what we do occurs at the level of our consciousness. So Bourdieu's concept of symbolic domination differs from false consciousness because it too operates below the level of our conscious awareness. Bourdieu argues that people accept social relationships without explicitly, reflectively knowing them, but simply taking them for granted as inevitable or self-evident. So Bourdieu prefers to use the concepts of doxa and habitus over that of false consciousness because he thinks that inequality is reproduced through people taking their situation for granted, for not thinking about it at all. For Bourdieu, the term habitus refers to our embodied practical sense, our embodied know-how, which drives our actions. And he thinks, it's that kind of, know-how which we don't really think about, rather than our practical consciousness, which shapes how we act. In Bourdieu's framework, the habitus operates in implicit, taken for granted ways as a sort of social instinct. So as we grow up, we develop habits and tastes and preferences and so on, which are strongly conditioned by the social conditions of our upbringing. And from that upbringing, we develop a tacit practical knowledge or sense of how to behave. We don't explicitly think about what we are doing, we just sort of instinctively know how to behave. So Bourdieu thinks most of our behaviour is shaped by these tacit social instincts rather than being self-conscious, self-aware, reflexive. Similarly, the term doxa refers to how there are implicit rules of the game which shape social arenas, which are much more important, Bourdieu thinks, than the kind of formal codified rules, the official rules. Doxa represent generally accepted beliefs and values about how things work in different institutions or fields, as Bourdieu calls them, in a university, in a family, and so on, but which operate below people's consciousness as a kind of unquestioned truth. That's just the way things are. That's just what you do. Because doxa are implicit, there means there are many things we take for granted and don't really recognise consciously about our social environments. So since he thinks that most of our social practice depends on such tacit, unquestioned assumptions, he also thinks that the main mechanism of domination operates through the unconscious manipulation of the body. He says domination operates in a much more subtle language than through forced consciousness, through assumptions embedded in our language, in our bodily habits, and through attitudes towards things which are below the level of consciousness. Because doxa operate below people's consciousness as a kind of unquestioned truth, Bourdieu thinks this means that it results in an acceptance of inequality. Our social environments are experienced as natural, inevitable, self-evident. This makes them hard to explicitly recognise, let alone question or criticise. And this also leads to what Bourdieu talks about when he talks about symbolic violence in the discussion. So what is symbolic violence? Well, the first thing to say is it's not physical violence. As the term suggests, it's symbolic. And what he means by this is where socially dominated groups, subordinate groups, come to internalise socially dominant values which position them as inferior. They come to accept those values as legitimate. So, for example, Bourdieu thinks one key doxa is the belief that society operates on a meritocratic basis. But if people accept that unquestionably, that means people's social position is the result of their own ability and efforts. So subordinate groups may see their social position as somehow deserved, as a result of their own failure or incompetence. So for Bourdieu, that makes resistance to inequality much more difficult to develop because people are not aware that they are being dominated, that their situation is unjust or unfair or exclusionary. He sees symbolic domination is a more effective and more brutal means of oppression than physical violence, because people, if you like, dominate themselves by accepting their position. Now, as I said, Eagleton disagrees with some of these arguments, and he makes some objections in the debate. And he makes several criticisms of Bourdieu's account. Firstly, he thinks that Bourdieu underestimates the extent of conflict and opposition to dominant groups or dominant values that occur in society. He thinks Bourdieu assumes too easily that people do accept dominant ideology. He argues that there are different degrees of acceptance, not just the naturalisation or internalisation of ruling ideas that Bourdieu focuses on, but also much more pragmatic or sceptical acceptance. So he thinks that people can be critical of dominant values and beliefs and yet may still conform to them. Now, Bourdieu doesn't accept this. He says in counter-argument, he suggests that people's capacity for resistance is always overestimated by left-leaning social analysts. He argues that very disadvantaged people are prepared to accept much more than many analysts think. He says they put up with a great deal and accepting their situation without knowing. What he means by that, without knowing that they are oppressed. And you've got to decide whether you agree more with Bourdieu or Eagleton on this. You also need to think about the Scott reading, because Scott examines the same set of issues as Bourdieu, but comes to very different conclusions. And he's much more critical of the kind of stance that Bourdieu is advancing than Eagleton is. He doesn't refer, as I say, directly to Bourdieu, but Bourdieu is definitely, or the type of argument that Bourdieu is advancing is in his sights. So the question that Scott examines is why do the majority of people seem to accept considerable levels of inequality? And in particular, why do disadvantaged groups seem to accept it? Now, in the course of his argument, he frames that to do the disadvantaged actually consent to inequality rather than why do they? But nonetheless, the initial framing of that problem is something that he takes up in other people's work. And the problem that other people are trying to explain is why subordinate groups often seem to accept, or at least to consent to, unequal arrangements that go against their interests when they don't seem to be directly coerced to do so. So Scott argues that most debates about power and ideology are focused on trying to explain this problem. And he argues the most common solution to the problem points to how a dominant or hegemonic ideology misrepresents social relations so that people consent because they have a false sense of reality. So essentially theories of false consciousness. Now, early accounts of this emerged to explain the failure of the Western working classes to overthrow capitalism, but also their compliance with authoritarian fascist regimes. Now, he's referring to theories of false consciousness, and Bourdieu says he doesn't advance a theory of false consciousness, but Scott identifies thick and thin versions of such theories, and you might want to think about where Bourdieu might fall in relationship to that continuum. So thick and thin versions of such explanations of the consent of subordinate groups to their own subordination. And they are thick and thin depending on the degree of ideological incorporation that these theories argue that people experience, the extent to which they see people swallowing dominant ideologies, accepting dominant values. Thick versions argue such ideologies produce consent from subordinates, while thin versions argue that they simply produce resignation among those groups. So the thick version argues that subordinate groups come to actively believe in the values that justify their subordination. Now, he's talking about theories of false consciousness, but we might argue that looks very close to Bourdieu's theory of symbolic violence, for example. So here, people's values are actively shaped by ideology or by their social conditions so that they internalise the values of dominant groups. The thinner version only argues that subordinate groups become convinced that social arrangements are inevitable, that it's just too difficult to change them. So the thin version may look like consent in terms of how people behave, in the sense that they are compliant, they carry on with their situation, but it doesn't change people's values in the sense that they may still think that their situation is wrong, just unchangeable. So what does Scott think about these different kinds of arguments? Well, he rejects both versions. So he's very critical of thick theories. He says they overstate ideological incorporation, as he terms it, the extent to which people swallow dominant values, dominant ideologies. And in an argument that's quite similar to the point that Eagleton makes, he argues that the history of dissent, resistance and rebellion shows that there are major limits to the ability of the powerful to control subordinates. He says we should be cautious about seeing the durability of inequality and power relations as resting in symbolic legitimation of power. Now, he thinks thin theories, the production of resignation, are on slightly stronger ground because people do often have a realistic or limited sense of what can be done about their situation. He argues that, sometimes ideology does sometimes work to define for subordinate groups what is realistic or not realistic. People might not like their situation, but if they think it's too difficult to get real change, then they just accept it as the way things are. There's certainly evidence of people thinking like this, and we've seen other studies in previous topics which suggest that people think like this. But Scott also sees problems with thin theories. Why? Well, he says, think about authoritarian and brutally coercive situations. We might expect people to be, completely resigned and feel powerless in those situations. But actually, we can see resistance, conflict, and rebellion even in those very coercive societies. They might think their situation was inevitable or hopeless. We might think they would think that in those circumstances, yet they still sometimes rebelled. And Scott makes an argument. He says we need to make certain that we don't see the appearance of consent as the same thing as people actually consenting, as actually internalising dominant values. And he thinks many theories mistake people's public show of compliance for consent. And of course, he says the behaviour of subordinate groups does sometimes make it look like they have accepted dominant values, they are compliant, they don't resist, and so on. But he says it's in their strategic interest to appear compliant. He argues subordinate groups often put on a public show of compliance to fool the powerful and keep them off their backs. He also argues that many theorists have been fooled by this. They mistake the appearance of consent for actual consent. Then there are three elements to this argument. Firstly, Scott argues that subversion and resistance are a widespread, even endemic feature of unequal social arrangements. But that has been underestimated by analysts who mistake the absence of kind of open and organised confrontation for consent. Secondly, Scott suggests that analysts are themselves taken in by the kind of the official or dominant account of social arrangements, and they fail to recognise that power relations give subordinates good reason to act as if they are consenting, even if they're not. And thirdly, he thinks that means that analysts have misunderstood the problem that needs to be explained. He says the problem isn't why do people consent to their own domination. Instead, it should be why do they appear to consent to inequality and their own domination. And that leads us to Scott's alternative explanation. So why do people appear to consent to unequal social arrangements? It's an alternative explanation, but to a rather different problem than the one Bourdieu is talking about. Scott argues that the answer simply rests in people's powerlessness and constraint. He says people may reject their situation, but they are practically unable to do anything about it. And that may be through a lack of collective solidarity that might help facilitate mobilisation. It's because of the risks of reprisals and sanctions if they do mobilise. He also argues that the routines and obligations of everyday life create strong pressures for compliance. People don't want to lose their jobs. They've got to feed their kids and so on. So that keeps people in line, whatever they think. And he says in some cases as well, people may have been discouraged if previous resistance has collapsed, been oppressed, or been bought off. So people may have seen the risks very concretely with mobilisations brought down. So Scott kind of changes the question that we need to be thinking about, and you need to think about whose arguments you find most sympathetic. So one of the things you might want to think about is do you agree with Bourdieu that disadvantaged groups accept their position without realising that they're dominated? And then there's a broader question: if Doxa, if dominant values are naturalised below the level of consciousness, how does Bourdieu know about them? And then, I've given you some hints here, but how does Scott's distinction between thick and thin theories relate to Bourdieu's account of doxa and symbolic violence? And then finally, do you agree with Scott's claim that disadvantaged groups seem compliant, but beneath the surface there's a great deal more dissent and resistance that we're often unaware of?